question of crisis inspired the answers and collaborative insights of the individuals and institutions responsible for this conference. For this, I thank you all, and am honored to be participating. All crises are themes in art because they are themes in the history of humanity, one whose fullness in any time must not be ruled by the presence of particular events such as we face today. With you, I ask, how can we, as Western scholars, interact with and represent Islamic art history, archaeology, and knowledge to overcome Western and Eurocentric misperceptions of Eastern civilizations? Diverse relationships with the Islamic East continue to contribute to and transform our global community positively in spite of a crisis in reception. We can affect this through the Academy's vision and ability to influence the propagation of objectified Islamic stereotypes and the homogenized image of persons and nations as a result of the war on terror, terrorism itself, and ISIS concepts. University of Arizona's Dr. Noorani does this in his essay, The Rhetoric of Security, citing Carl Schmitt's 1932, The Concept of the Politicals, critique of liberal politics and self-preservation as a primordial fact outside of moral normativity. Noorani concluded, quote, "The idea here is that no end or objective having to do with the way we think things ought to be can justify dying and killing. We are only driven to these in cases of pure necessity when we merely need to survive," unquote. As Christine Taghini began yesterday, the archaeologist is to look, understand, and to interpret. And I would add, which I think we would all agree, this is also what the artist and the historian does. I suggest all of us can do this and better envision solutions in our work with the assistance of Ibn Khaldun's approach to history. Idris Shah, in The Darkest England, credited this 14th century Tunisian with Andalusian ancestors as a source of inspiration, quote, "accepted even in the West as the first theoretician of human historical development, the founder of sociology, in fact," unquote. Ibn Khaldun's own introduction defines history as, quote, "History is a discipline widely cultivated among nations and races. It is eagerly sought after. The men in the street, the ordinary people, aspire to know it. Kings and leaders vie for it. Both the learned and the ignorant are able to understand it. For on the surface, history is no more than information. Elegantly presented, inspired with proverbs, it serves to entertain. The inner meaning of history, on the other hand, involves speculation and an attempt to get at the truth, subtle explanation of the causes and origins of existing things, and deep knowledge of the how and why of events. History, therefore, is firmly rooted in philosophy. It deserves to be accounted a branch of it," unquote. Filled with records, including socio-political conflicts, Ibn Khaldun's 14th century Muqaddimah, an introduction to history, provides an essential text as practical schema for contemporary use. Its geographical notations, valuable to our own histories, reference Ptolemy and introduces to Sharaf al-Hadrisi's Book of Roger. Its world map with 7 zones and its detailed internal sections include Europe and Asia. The Muqaddimah text is a paradoxical one. It offers practical cases with scientific clarity, while biased from a secular point of view, in that it can be labeled Islamic. And yet, from an Islamic point of view, the basis for Ibn Khaldun's relationship with knowledge, the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's hadith, are taken to be as objective. So, this Islamic text, Ibn Khaldun begins with, quote, "The nature of civilization, Bedouin and settled life, the achievement of superiority, gainful occupations, ways of making a living, sciences, crafts, and all the other things that affect civilization, the causes and reasons thereof," unquote. His universal contextualization of social history exists within a larger, holistic Islamic frame. This provides the basis for our own research, setting aside the ideological atmosphere of a global terrorism that Schmidt and Noorani confront us with. Within his classifications narratives, he includes sectarian references to Sunni, Shia, Sufism, the schools of jurisprudence, when appropriate, just as secular histories communicate the influence and events of Catholic and Protestant denominations in post-Reformation Europe. Ibn Khaldun bore the scholar's responsibility in deference to Allah as his only judge, removing any interest akin to modern concerns to be politically correct or Muslim apologetics, and he analyzes religious, dynastic, and other forms of propaganda. It is a history which does not change while it changes. The Muqaddimah highlights the need for bridging texts of past and present, but we need colleagues who are not just Islamic scholars, but Muslim, to minimize losses in translation, schisms of trans-historical and cultural difference, and endow our scholarship with an expertise deserving our inclusion and respect, because we cannot achieve this knowledge any other way. No matter what I do, I will never know what it is to be black. In the case of Ibn Khaldun, these deviate from a consistently modern tone at times, which happens even when he makes critical assertions. I went for support in these moments of question with translation with the work of Iraqi sociologist Dr. Ali Alwardi and his sociological analysis on Ibn Khaldun's theory, a study of the sociology of knowledge. Quote, "Alwardi discovered Ibn Khaldun was the only thinker to rebel against the idealistic way of thinking prevalent in Islam. Although his peers did not understand him at the time, he tried to dismantle Aristotelian logic and build a new one based on changing social realities," unquote. Written from this perspective, the Muqaddimah remains beneficial to Muslims and non-Muslim scholars in light of colonization and a Middle East formally redrawn by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Alwardi powerfully addressed Ibn Khaldun's critics by citing, quote, "the ignorance of the nature of the various conditions arising in civilization. Every event or phenomenon, whether it comes into being in connection with some essence or as the result of an action, must inevitably possess a nature peculiar to its essence, as well as to the accidental conditions that may attach themselves to it. If the student knows the nature of events and the circumstances and requirements in the world of existence, it will help him to distinguish the truth from untruth in investigating the historical information critically. This is more effective in critical investigation than any other aspect that may be brought up in connection to it," unquote. Writing in 1950, Alwardi raised the specter of larger transcultural misperceptions as a byproduct of translation, and noting the apparent contradiction of Ibn Khaldun's opinion on the same thing being both good and bad, useful and harmful. Without going into Said Nursi's on the nature of evil, we can understand this quite simply by fire being destructive in the hands of an arsonist, or beneficial in heating food, confirming how historic and cultural meanings remain beyond straight readings of any single manuscript and magnify cause for caution towards religious ones. Alwardi raised the issue of Western discomfort with Rosenthal's translation of the Muqaddimah's use of savageness in English, which I had no Arabic word for to pursue. Alwardi advised, quote, "Living under the influence of modern civilization, the writers cannot refrain from the conclusion that savageness is one of the most degrading and shameful traits any nation can be labeled with. Looking through the perspective of Ibn Khaldun, on the other hand, we may see that savageness is not so degrading as those critics think. Following the argument of Ibn Khaldun, one may see that the word savageness can mean the same as words manliness, bravery, liberty, pride, and the like, and often as indications of defectiveness in man," unquote. This defectiveness of the savage in Ibn Khaldun's text relates characteristics of civilizations, Bedouin versus sedentary luxury cultures, their specific production in the arts, architecture, life of regions and eras, correlating the fulfillment of specific desires with the effects which contribute to that civilization's stability, its rise and fall. Not isolated to Islamic cultures, these aspects continue with 21st century globalization throughout material cultures, East and West, and markedly in art's shift from the crafts of necessity and use to the artists and works of art as individual luxury brands. Ibn Khaldun's text includes pre-Islamic histories, and accommodates the unique characteristics of culture and Islam from Morocco to East Asia. What of the context? Crediting Hegel and Marx's prologues to any concept of an end of ideology, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History's essay in 1989 responded to what he saw as, quote, "the triumph of the West, of the Western idea, is evident, first of all, in the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government," unquote. On this point, anti-Islamic tendencies join all-encompassing anti-religious ones. Religious histories, which are inherently global, do not correspond with neoliberal plans for commerce-driven alternatives. Beyond fundamentalist or fanatic interpretations, these religions' original narratives do not conform to socio-political systems as ultimate endgame. Any linear end of history is the result of what prophets communicated as end through corresponding revelations, including those of indigenous peoples globally. These ideologies with primordial roots, as ancient as they are contemporary, continue to affect social narrative and arts in either traditional or selective application or by denial. Quote, "Australia's Aboriginal spirituality does not consider the dream time as a time past. In fact, not as a time at all. Time refers to past, present, and future, but the dream time is none of these. The dream time is there with them. It is not a long way away. The dream time is the environment that the Aboriginal lived in, and it still exists today all around us," says Aboriginal author Mudruru, unquote. As for the history of all religious art, while it is not necessary to agree with the articles of faith, their religious symbolism must be understood as they relate to the individual and community to transmit these formulas as records of local or globalized art histories. Without understanding the Russian Orthodox religion, one cannot appreciate how it inspired Kandinsky to give birth to abstraction in art as the way to express this particular Christian worldview concerning the spiritual and art, and how, again, might any influence of the Mohammedan exhibition that he attended in Munich or his journey to Tunis affected that imagery. Without this form of knowledge, Andy Warhol's devout adherence to the Byzantine Catholic Church and her symbolism cannot be detected throughout his pop iconography. The carpets of the Middle East are revealed to be Islamic when one understands the floral designs are inspired by Quranic descriptions of paradise, igniting the imagination of tribal weavers living in arid lands and deserts. I ask you to include artists in your research to better understand this impulse across time. Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah is a comprehensive template with potential beyond static and linear time. It is cyclical. In Alexander Nagel's Medieval Modern Art Out of Time, quote, "There is no question, therefore, of denying the persistent recourse to non-Western alternatives throughout 20th century art, but only of producing some materials toward a reframing of that unending search for alternatives to the modern Western bourgeois culture. The new and more open framework proposed here destabilizes the terms Western art and modernism, and thus can only have troubling effects for the ways of thinking that produce terms like primitivism," unquote. The concept that the medieval can be simultaneously modern is a binary Western classification that has long been what we have been addressing, and the Muqaddimah similarly locates the universal and the religious in a holistic social history. A Shakespearean production performed in iambic pentameter Old English, while visually set in a contemporary period, provides an audience experience neither purely Elizabethan or modern, instead confirming universal themes regardless of place or time. Western classifications of history and art prior to and during its birth as capital A art, in the Renaissance, its Enlightenment, modern, postmodern, Christian, and secular metamorphoses can be better understood by searching trans-religious history for what we have neglected as a result of Western empire ideologies. The crisis of current wars, occupations, and the pressures of a global economy provide new opportunities to excavate data as a result of the ages of information and technology. We can counter notions of Islamic radicalization and destabilize academic monopolies of Western and modern intellectual hegemony when we reposition Eastern voices as understood as multivalent outcomes. Ibn Khaldun sounds a cautionary voice, quote, "Untruth naturally afflicts historical information. There are various reasons that make this unavoidable. One of them is partisanship for opinions and schools. If the soul is impartial in receiving information, it devotes to that information the share of critical investigation the information deserves, and its truth or untruth thus becomes clear. However, if the soul is infected with partisanship for a particular opinion or sect, it accepts without a moment's hesitation the information that is agreeable to it. Prejudice and partisanship obscure the critical faculty and preclude critical investigation. The result is that falsehoods are accepted and transmitted," unquote. Partisan reparations, Western and Eastern, are integral to contemporary scholarship in pursuit of empirical excellence. While this may have seemed an impossibility involving not just Islamic but any religious materials, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah details collaborative relationships between the various sciences and religion, the observable and the metaphysical, and the imperatives of shared knowledge as the real legacy. which Spain knows intimately. While this conference focused on Islamic art history, there is a larger crisis of religious modern art as a result of materialism and secular censorship which affect the future of all art history. In 1944, at Mount Holyoke Women's College in Massachusetts, in a paper at the last Pontigny Decades Symposium in Exile, New York abstract expressionist Robert Motherwell said that, quote, "The artist is the last spiritual guide in a property-obsessed world, after the collapse of religion as the basis of life, and will be forced into a spiritual underground," unquote. His paper's original title, censored from the place of the spiritual in a world of property to the modern artist's world for publication. Less than a century has passed, and the face of religious modern art already demands archaeological attention to unearth its presence behind masks of secularity and the spiritual. This is happening with contemporary Islamic art. What is increasingly being asked of Islamic arts now is not to express itself, but to directly rebut terrorism and become as secular as our own, reflecting the dangers of cynicization that Yuka Kadoy spoke of earlier today. Much work remains to be done to provide our colleagues in the future with corrected histories of the past and providing current ones as suitable companion texts for what Ibn Khaldun has provided for us from 7 centuries ago. We can anticipate future historians' questions because of shared histories, crises, and our universal need for answers. Given what has been presented by all of you these past few days, I'm humbled, and I thank you all.
Thank you very much for your introduction. It's time to make questions, if you have some questions. Questions?
Yeah, thank you for your refreshing presentation for the thought. Okay, it's working? Not working, so I say it in loud voice. More than a question is a point. The real quote from Ronald Reagan that you mentioned here, it looks more a Dan Quayle quote than a Ronald Reagan quote, because it was the kind of quotes that Dan Quayle, the vice president of Bush Senior, was making. That's my point. It looks like.
The way it was framed said nothing about Dan Quayle, but I see your comparison.
Because I heard a similar quote from Dan Quayle in the States that it looks a little bit like. That's one my point.
I'm surprised he would know of him. Either of them, actually. Though it's interesting, it's 1993 and not during the administration.
Yeah, that's very interesting, in fact, because those years, it was in the States, listening a lot of practical jokes about him, even if he was a vice president, and a lot of the quotes, real quotes and practical, fictitious practical jokes about him was in that way. It was shock to me when I was listening to your refreshing presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question? No. Questions? So, thank you.
Thank you.